All right, so thank you everyone and welcome to this Northwest Cujo webinar. My name is Megan Lockwood. I am the Northwest Cujo Communications Director, and in my day job, I'm an executive assistant and project manager at Oregon State University. We're excited today to be able to provide this opportunity to Northwest Cujo members and beyond to learn from a couple of Northwest Cujo legends, I think. We will hear today from Kurt Haapala with Malum Architects and Josh Gana at the University of Washington. They presented this program at the 2025 annual conference. There might be updates, I'm not sure, but we've asked them to do a virtual version for us here today. I'm going to let them do more intros and dive on in. So thank you so much, Kurt and Josh. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, happy to be here. Excited to share this again. I think Josh, you're our lead off, and as I recall, well, we might get the transitions wrong because we didn't practice again.
Yeah.
But, so we're
You're
legends.
driving the slides, so I'm relying on you to keep us moving forward.
I'll do that. I believe I'll do that. I just hit advance and it didn't work. Here we go. Um, when we gave this presentation, we were actually in Seattle, and so we did at the time acknowledge the ancestral homelands of the tribes that have really stewarded the lands in the Seattle area. I might suggest we take a moment and allow others to just think about the communities that have stewarded the lands that you sit on. I noticed there's some folks from Oregon State and other locations, but um, I know I speak for Josh and the University of Washington, but when we do our work together, we really lean into a place of inclusion and equity, and not just from an acknowledgement standpoint, but the ways we can make action. We can make our thoughts and feelings about the stewardship more actionable. And so, I would just take a moment to let you all think about those populations that have cared for the land since time immemorial.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. We are excited to be here today. This is just a brief glimpse of the agenda, but just stepping back for a minute, the buildings and places that we live and work in and our residents live, work, and study in are the environments where community happens and where belonging happens. And so there's a direct connection between the spaces and the student experience and student development. And the concept of this presentation is rooted in that belief and rooted in the belief that every student housing professional has a role in making that happen. And particularly as we all advance in our careers, we may find ourselves sitting around a design table and not having any clue what the architects are talking about, but that, we have an important role in that process as housing practitioners. So Kurt and I were excited to put this together and help at least give a primer of some of the issues, topics, and conversations that you might find yourself engaged in if you find yourself in that process at some point in your career. So you at least look like you know what you're talking about a little bit, know where your injects and points of entry are. So as Kurt and Megan mentioned, my name's Josh Gana. I am now the Executive Director and Assistant Vice President of Student Life at University of Washington. I've been here 14 years and over 20 years in the housing field. And of that time, I've been involved in 14 new building projects as a housing professional, including, I think it's 6 buildings now with Malum and Kurt and his team.
Wow, of all the things I didn't update, your title.
That's okay.
Congratulations, Josh. It's a big deal in our family. So my name is Kurt Haapala. I'm a partner with Malum Architects. I've been really focused on student housing and student-centric design for the majority of my career. And you're right, we've had great relationships with Josh on multiple campuses working on projects. In fact,
Yeah, before we go into that, I just want to do a little virtual hand raise exercise. So using the raise hand feature in Zoom. And if you've been involved in a housing construction or building project, will you put your little Zoom hand up and make yourself known? Or if you have one on the map on your campus that you might have the opportunity to be involved with here in the near future. Great. Everyone else, I would say that, you never know when this is going to land in your portfolio. I didn't expect to be, 14 buildings in at this point in my career and just happened into it. And each project has a bit of a different lens, but wanted to just spend a minute as an entree. I worked at Oregon State University for several years before I moved to University of Washington, and I was a pretty young professional at that time and was managing service desks and assignments, and found myself engaged at a pretty high level in a new project that was a partnership with a new English language learning program at Oregon State University, and had a building associated with it, the International Living Learning Center. And it was a pretty complicated building project for a variety of reasons, but it's one that very early on in my career solidified my role in a design project, even though I'm not an architect or an engineer or construction manager, but I'm a student housing professional, that my seat at that table was every bit as important as everyone else on the team. And my room for conversation and expertise was articulating student needs and student development in the physical manifestation. And you see some of the images of that, of early little teeny bopper Josh. I don't know what's going on in the right picture with my body language there, when the architect, oh yeah, I see what's going on. It's like, what the heck are you talking about? But, finding your role and finding the things that you're an expert in your field. And the left photo here is an example of a room mock-up that we asked to be done based on the design dimensions, because one of the proposals in this design process was rooms that had a little bit of a smaller floor plate than the standard at campus. And quite honestly, I was afraid, being the one managing assignments and what have you, that they were too small and that you would have that effect where the roommates could be lying in beds and high-five each other without getting out of bed. Wanted to make sure that wasn't true. And we went through this exercise and pushed the crew to actually do a floor plate layout for us and confirm that it was comfortable and appropriate. And those are the types of things that, you and I can get involved with and really exert our influence on a project. So that project has stuck with me ever since, because of the way that I was included and incorporated, and the design team really worked with me as an equal partner to deliver a great outcome.
Thanks, Josh. It was a fun project, and it was a fast project too. There's a whole story around that as well. And that was a new construction project, and I've often reflected that the renovations that we often find ourselves working on or collaborating with, big and small renovations, can have as much and sometimes even more impact. One of my favorite projects is down at San Diego State, polishing this 9-story concrete residence hall, and then really infusing it with the spaces that promote equity, promote academic excellence. But here was the original project, and our ability to transform it into something really contemporary, really bright. These tired old community spaces with tired old furniture, and then doing something really inclusive and inviting. And then even finding opportunities that might not have been thought about in the mid-century, to take an old roof and turning it into a really great student amenity with amazing views to the Mission Bay here in this situation. And then bringing the culture in, this unique opportunity to learn about the surf culture in San Diego and infuse that into the architecture and into the art, was really a powerful place as well. So anyway, so those experiences may in fact be yours as you increase in your, move forward in your career. So we just want to take a moment and just underscore, well, why is this topic important? And I do think this design competency, the phrase that Josh and I selected, is really important, not only to understand what the architects and engineers and project managers might be thinking, but to know where your role is and where your voice is to have huge impact. Other thoughts? We can all read these learning outcomes.
The
I think
other piece that I would add, and this is the final bullet point on why this is important, each institution has a different set of values, culture, flavor, and philosophy on student housing. And that's the other big impact that we have, where, an architect like Kurt works on 10 campuses, 20 campuses a year. And we're the ones that are able to localize that work and make sure it's meeting the academic needs of our community and the developmental needs of our community.
And honestly, this presentation was a bit of a outcome of an article that we wrote for the Talking Stick, the January edition, just trying to develop this competency more broadly. And it just made perfect sense to translate it into a presentation for our regional conference. So there's the QR code if you haven't read this, and you can grab it or just go back to the January 25 edition, and you'll see the article and read a little bit more about it. So let's get into this. So we're going to skip across the surface on a lot of high-level themes, and I think, Josh, if I recall, I kind of like talk about it, and then you bring in the student impact, right? That's that's the way we did it.
Yep,
Okay.
that's what we did.
So a decent sized project, that may be a $5 million project on your campus or a $50 million project on your campus. There are a lot of players. There are a lot of skilled professionals that really weigh in. And on the owner's side, there are a number of them that you yourself interacting with. It's not just university leadership or departmental leadership, i.e. your senior housing officers and those folks. But there will be a steering committee that is comprised of a cross-disciplinary university group that will be making most of the core decisions. But we also need to listen to the building operators, which would include custodial and maintenance. There may be a staff in another department that actually manages the buildings or manages the systems of the buildings, I should say. And then probably last and certainly not least are the building occupants, i.e. our clientele, our students, and the RAs, the RDs, your housing staff that really interacts with the building. Their voices are so critical in understanding the particular project and the details and circumstances of a particular campus. Okay, hold on a second here. The design team is also a fairly broad, multidisciplinary group of professionals. Yes, the architects are usually the design leaders of that group of merry individuals, but landscape architects that pay attention to the site and the vegetation, the civil engineer that is primarily paying attention to infrastructure in the ground. Structural engineers, they are the ones tending to the structural uh, uh, structural forces and stands up. And then systems engineers, there are mechanical and electrical and plumbing and acoustical and accessibility and signage and wayfinding and door access controls. There's so many specialty consultants that will really weigh into this, and you'll find yourself interacting with them at different moments in a process.
There's literally a consultant for everything. We have a trash compactor and chute consultant we use on our campus.
There you go. An elevator consultant,
No,
a
yeah.
envelope anyway. Another really important player in a project team is the authorities having jurisdiction, the AHJ. Those are folks that are often involved or city employees or county or state employees that have the responsibility and the construction meets codes, meets the state of Washington guidelines, meets the city of Seattle guidelines. And so you can find yourself interacting with land use planners, a design commission. The University of Washington has a design commission. All new projects and significant renovation projects must go before the design commission and seek approval. Many universities are structured that way. Fire department's very important. So there's just a lot of layers of folks that check and double check the work, I guess is a simple way to put it, and make sure that it is safe and it is compliant with codes and regulations. So the actual individuals that put the building together, that screw in the drywall and paint the drywall, are the construction team, and that is also probably the largest team. There are hundreds of tradespeople at any moment on a job site doing everything from site utilities to structural installation to plumbing and drywall, as I noted earlier. So the general contractor or the GC is usually the head of that very diverse and broad team. They are the ones that hold the contracts with the drywall subcontractor or the plumbing subcontractor, and they interpret the drawings that we create and then build the buildings. So it's a big team. So Josh, this is yours.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think is really helpful to center, Kurt just talked through hundreds of people that are involved at various points in a life cycle of a project that could be anywhere from a year to 3+ years. And, everyone is there in the big picture to accomplish the same thing, which is to deliver an outcome that meets students and the department's needs. And, to be honest, it isn't always a smooth process. There's tension at times, there's a give and take. And doing the same thing that we do with our communities of taking the assumption that everyone's there to do their best work and everyone has a unique perspective and skill to add into the mix really helps to center that conversation. Everyone on the team's got the ability to make decisions that impact the result. We all want the safest, highest quality project, and it's not the only thing on our plates. And, we put on here that no one necessarily has the right answer. And I would say every single project is different and there isn't necessarily a right answer, which is why it's important to understand values and context when making decisions. And, it can be intimidating for us housing people to do that sometimes because, like I said at the top of this presentation, we don't come in with the same background and it's really easy to get lost in the process and the lingo. So, understanding that you have a unique perspective, your professional experience is part of the work of that team, and that you may be the only one in the room that's an expert in student learning and development amongst a bunch of people that are then charged with building a building. So the design team is an expert in how to manifest that in the space, but your ability to be comfortable articulating what you know professionally about that learning and development needs and what students want as well is really critical. And asking questions is really part of that process. I have found myself puzzling and not understanding something, and being willing to raise your hand and stop the conversation and ask an insightful question can really, even if you feel like other people already know the answer, can really help, again, sort of center that conversation and clarify key decisions. So my first piece of advice here when we're talking about team composition is just recognize if you are involved in one of these processes, you're in that process for a reason, and that's your expertise, and you have a role. We actually on our campus will, if we're able to put the resident director as well as our Residence Hall Association president on design teams for projects. And that's also been a really effective strategy for us.
So an entire design process actually starts in most public institutions, but many, many private institutions as well, is with a procurement process and picking the right partner. And that starts with its own sort of internal process. It's a transparent process to select the experienced architectural candidates to hire for a specific project. This is right out of the AIA contracts explanation. I know you can't probably read all this as quickly as you need to, but we can make this available. And as Megan noted, this is being recorded. But there's usually a 3 to 4 step process, and it begins with a request for qualifications. The shorthand is RFQ. That is a request that a university puts out to say, hey, we are doing a new project. Here are the details of the project. We are looking for skilled and experienced design teams to submit. And then we all submit, and there's a shortlisting process. Josh has probably had stacks of a dozen architectural submissions on his desk that he's had to read through a weekend and score to develop a shortlist to say these 3 or 4 candidates are the best, most qualified to take the next step with us, which is a request for proposal, shorthand RFP. And the RFP process has its own requirements and questions. And from there is often a finalist interview where you're inviting your design team to come in and really get a feel, this is going to be anywhere, as Josh noted, a 3 to 5 year relationship. They're qualified, they are insightful. Can I see myself working with them? And there is a selection committee that is established by your university that goes through that process. And if it's a student housing project, you bet that there are student housing representation on this process committee. Now, once there's a partner in place, on the construction side, there are a number of contractual delivery models. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Don't worry about not remembering them, but if you hear the acronym, you're like, oh, I think I remember that. So design bid build is a way where the design team produces a complete set of documents. It is advertised. The general contractor puts a bid together and says, I can build this project for $50 million. They are the low bidder, and then they are awarded that contract by the university to build it. There's another model where it's called design build, where the architect and a general contractor is a coordinated, integrated team and presents themselves to the university to be their design build team partner and going through similar motions. And that's an interesting model. Another model is construction manager at risk. In the state of Washington, it's actually called GCCM, which stands for General Contractor Construction Manager. And in Oregon, we switched the acronym and call it CMGC. Essentially, it's another integrated approach where the owner, the university, hires a design team with a single contract and hires a general contractor with another contract. But the three are the core elements: the owner, the design team, and the contractor. They're the core to build any kind of a project. Lately, there's been some other models at the bottom here, integrated project delivery, which is getting even more collaborative and more integrated. And so the message here is there are a number of contractual project delivery methods that you will hear talked about in a university or stakeholder setting.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to that aspect, if you end up on a project team or having a project on your campus, asking the question of what the methodology is, and then at that point, learning a little bit more about that model is probably a great strategy versus trying to, become an expert in all of them, because they all take different flavors. And some campuses have only one way they do it. Other campuses have a choice based on the nature of the project. The things that I think about as a university partner in terms of picking the right partner is that our role in that procurement process is really looking to how does that bidder or firm's values align with the institution and housing program? Do they have experience working in student housing? That isn't necessarily a requirement, but I found that the firms that we work with that have done housing before sort of get it in a different way. Thinking about which firms talk about the student experience if they're doing an interview, or are they all about the business and the design? Do they know what it's like working on a college campus and have experience thinking about, impact during finals week? And then what team listens the best when I speak or ask questions are all indicators for me that that partner might be one that we want to move forward with.
All right, so let's move into another important area. It's called scheduling success, understanding the entire building process. So I'm going to take you through uh, a little bit of the terminology and definitions of schedule. And the project schedule really is this critical tool that establishes a series of timelines with which the work will progress. And they're often tied to our opening of this academic year, because we all know that we have anywhere from 500 to 2,000 students arriving in our buildings, and they need to be ready. And so we often work backwards from those dates and understanding your move-in process. We'll talk about that a little later. But anyway, there are certain phases of design, and there are often phases of construction, which is a distinct period where a certain task has to be dealt with. Milestones are significant moments in time where you have achieved whatever. Maybe you have achieved the completion of the design process, or even during construction, a milestone might be when it's often called you've topped off. You've actually completed the structural assembly of the building, and that's a moment where there's a reduced risk and actually a moment of celebration on the construction side. This term critical path right in the center of the slide often refers to the critical element that you need to attend to, which has the highest risk of project failure. And the critical path may be different things in different projects, different campuses, and different circumstances. Sometimes it might be a jurisdictional critical path, where if you don't get your permits in time, you won't make the end date because the construction has to happen at a certain time, or the critical path might be funding a cycle or something of that nature. Substantial completion is a big phrase that we all look forward to, because that is essentially saying that the authorities having jurisdiction have deemed the project substantially complete, and that's one step closer to being able to hand Josh the keys, and he can open the doors and let his students arrive with their carts full of lovely goodies. So substantial completion could be a term that you hear a lot about. And then the C of O, the certificate of occupancy, that's when the city of Seattle hands Josh an actual document that says it's done. You are legally allowed to occupy the building, and that is the moment that probably some champagne gets uncorked, but not on campus, somewhere else. It's a big completion milestone for projects. This is a very simple project schedule, which is we use graphic tools to help bring all the complexity together so it's easy to understand that there's a programming phase and a design phase, and we do budget alignment, and you see the little graphic dollar signs. So we are always looking at budget and making sure that the owner's budget, the university budget, is in alignment with the project that we are designing and ultimately building. And so this is the simplified version. This is what actually happens. There are so many decisions and so much nuance with any given week during the design phase between consultants and contractors and all sorts of things that the schedule is just this hypercritical tool to manage, maintain, and make sure that you're meeting those milestones.
And the role that we play on the housing side in the scheduling is really thinking about, does that project schedule align with the appropriate academic cycle? And then, thinking about, is the phasing appropriate for our overall occupancy management plan? For instance, if we are scheduled to have a substantial completion of a building and certificate of occupancy in February, that does me no good, because then I'm not going to move people in February, and then you got a building sitting there that you're paying for 3 or 4 months before it actually has revenue. And so there's an occupancy management piece to it. You want to align with academic years. And there's also oftentimes on a campus, particularly if you're looking at multiple projects, phasing of those projects in the big picture. One of the things that we did for the 10 years on our campus that we were doing something every year is that, we couldn't close a building to demolish it until we had new beds to move the students into, metaphorically. We didn't want to decrease in bed space for a year. And so we had to be really strategic about the order of projects. And that was really driven by the university. And then you've got the more micro level of construction impacts during move in, move out, finals, and then making sure that both from a impact perspective, but also a marketing and sort of building excitement and energy perspective, that you're finding the right times with the residents and student body to make outreach opportunities.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the design process from concept to deliverable. And so this is a bit of an explanation of the phases that the architects and the design teams go through to get the project to a place where it can be permitted and then bid for construction. And these are the traditional phases that we often go through. And in a big complex project, you're really going to take the time and go through these phases. With smaller, more nimble projects with maybe more nimble budgets, you might collapse some of these processes because you just don't need to go through all of the process motions. But it often begins with programming and pre-design. And that is that initial phase where we work with the client, and it's often the housing folks in particular, to understand the programmatic spatial requirements of any residence hall. It's not just the rooms themselves or the bathrooms, but all the other ancillary common areas or residential support spaces, or even how big should the boiler room be, or the back of house stuff. We call it back of house. All the stuff that you never get to see, but that runs the building. We have to figure all that out. And then we launch into what's called schematic design. That's the early design phase where we're working in big concepts and coming up with this preferred concept that we can then move into what is called design development. And that's actually exactly what it is. We develop the design. We move the schematic into more detail. We start looking at window types and maybe the materials of the building and how these details come together. Once we receive approval for design development, we move into construction documents, and that's where we literally draw every door and every detail that the contractor needs to build the building. And then during construction, the design team's role is called construction administration, where our job legally is to be on site at regular intervals to make sure that the building is being built to the intent that the drawings communicated. And there's lots of details in between there. But so let's paint that picture. What does that look like? So programming and pre-design, a lot of engagement. We listen and are curious about all the things on this campus or this project is required to do. These are a couple of student engagement sessions that we've hosted. One is at Western Washington University, the other is at Oregon Tech. We have a lot of fun with these because we get to interact with students and listen to the hopes and dreams, and I'm so sick and tired of this and I wish we had that, and we try and translate that into practical and affordable solutions that begin to inform a schematic design. So we ask a lot of questions during program and pre-design because it's a feedback loop and we're listening and taking notes. During schematic design, we start to use some of our visual communication tools, which is often drawing. We still draw with pens, and this is rolls of trace paper that we use to start to scribble our ideas. We'll work in models and build them in a way that you can engage with them. So this is an example of, I think, down at University of Oregon, where the housing folks were actually moving walls and puzzle pieces around. They're like, well, maybe this should go here because it's a better adjacency or a better student flow. So we really work through a big idea with you. We spent some time massing up a building, and when I say massing, you can see this diagram in the lower right. It begins to look like a building, but it's really stacks of programmatic information. We cite it on a three-dimensional map, and you can see this gentleman is pointing at a concept idea for Western Washington. You see the trees and you see roads and other buildings, so we're starting to pay attention to those bigger issues. Moving into design development, we take it a step further. We get into building information modeling. In the lower left, you see a 3D digital model of the building, and you're starting to see ductwork and plumbing and stairs and columns. So we start getting pretty serious about it. We actually use 3D visualization. This is Vicky, Josh, who's got the 3D VR set, and she was walking through the building virtually as we were designing Alma Clark Glass Hall. You should ask her about that.
I can't use those. I get vertigo.
Well, yeah, you can't stay in VR very long. I get sick too. So, so there's a jar of aspirin just off the picture. No, just kidding. So design development also includes renderings. We start to give three-dimensional clarity and options. This is a new residential building, apartment building at University of Oregon. You can see a couple different looks at what it could look like. We mocked up the unit at the University of Oregon. So we're getting very serious about the details of the project. And then construction documentation, I think it's a ton of work, and we start to interact with the university less because we're drawing the building. And that's where the quintessential architect with the roll of drawings that you see in the Brady Bunch or on some movie set, that's what we're doing. We're making these pages and pages of drawings that are everything from window details to casework to, where does the plumbing go and how does it interface with the structural columns? And that eventually moves into construction, where you can see representatives here on site talking with the general contractor saying, well, this is Jeremy Rear, having a conversation about, is the wall in the right place? He's like, maybe it needs to be this way a little bit. And this other group is staring up at a light fixture, and because we don't think it's in the, so there's that kind of, this is a little visual explanation of what we go through. Construction administration also uses our digital technology and uses those tools to help inform how they build the buildings. It's gotten very, very high tech, and at the end of the day, there are still wood studs and screws, so it's still also very low tech at the same time.
Yeah, this design phase is really an opportunity for your expertise to shine, because you're, as a team, making decisions about the way the building and the space and the community lays out. And I'm a really big believer that the physical environment impacts student behavior and student development. And so this is the time on paper to get it right, because once you get past the paper phase, it gets very, very expensive to change anything. Even if you're removing something, it still seems to cost more. So your expertise in that student development and the student experience is well placed here. It's also articulating what your campus's philosophy on unit types are. On our campus, we generally believe that first-year students are best served by having at least one roommate from a developmental perspective. And so we certainly put in singles, but that's not the predominant mode. And if it is more of an apartment style, that's targeted towards an upper class student. Thinking about how your campus considers community and associated space types. We generally on our campus work in configurations of 40 to 50 students. So every 25 double rooms will have a study lounge and a floor kitchen and an RA. And so thinking that, making sure that gets in there. Being able to articulate how the physical environment impacts behavior and development. And then also, really being an advocate and a voice for both what students want, but also what we know they need. Because if, back to my roommate example, I think that most students would say, yeah, of course I want a single. I don't want to share a room. But we know based on our academic training and expertise that isn't always best. So finding that right balance. Finding the organizational values and infusing those, such as sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion in the project. And then finally, thinking about the staff experience, because it's both our residential life teams, but also our operations and facilities staff that are going to be living with that building for the next 30 years. So making sure you get their input and advocate. We have tried to the extent possible to pull our custodial break rooms out of basements and give them some daylight and things like that.
So the construction process, we're going to go through that very quickly, but it often begins with some celebratory moments. There's often the groundbreaking ceremonies. This happens to be a new health professions building at Lane Community College that we were a part of. And there's the golden shovels, and this is usually where the president or Josh will show up and get the pictures for the press and the turning of the shovel. And then we get to work. The picture on the right is a little bit of a humorous shot. It's my staff, architect, and the superintendent on the construction, and they really do need to form a cohesive team. And this was a bit of a stage shot, but they worked incredibly well together. As an owner, I imagine when that's not going well, it just makes everything else harder. And I'd like to think you've never experienced that, Josh, but maybe you have. I don't know. The owner is involved as well. We're using technology, but this is an example of a mock-up that the owner is reviewing with us to make sure it is meeting their expectations. And sometimes the mock-up, and I should even pause and talk about what's a mock-up. This is a wall mock-up that we do off-site. Ideally, it's not on the building, where because there are a number of pieces to that puzzle. There's wall flashing, the blue stuff is wall flashing, and then there's the siding, and there are pieces that have to come together in a certain way. And the contractor puts this together so that we can review it and say, yes, you have got the sequencing right, the joints look tight, do it all on the entire building, because what you don't want to do is get half the building done, it's all wrong, and now you've got a huge cost issue and a schedule issue because it didn't come together quite right. So mock-ups are very important for all parties. The next series of slides are just maybe rudimentary, but kind of fun at the same time. This is a series of slides that shows a residence hall at Pacific University going up. It's not a video time lapse. I probably should have brought that, but I just wanted to identify the different phases of construction. So you've got to clear the site. So they've done a nice job of getting the site nice and clear of any utilities or trees or grass or anything that was there. And then you first go into underground utilities where you have to run electrical and plumbing and the waste lines for the toilets and data and telecommunication, because that all has to come underground and then up into the building. So that gets done first. And then they start digging the footings and then layering in the elements below the footings and the steel rebar to hold the concrete slab in place before they pour. So a lot goes in the ground that you never see. Millions of dollars go into the ground that you never see, but you benefit from. And then you start coming out of the ground with the structural, which might be wood framed, it might be steel, it might be concrete. And then you start assembling walls. Often in student housing, it's done in floor to floor to floor. So you start to see this buildup of wood frame construction over time. And while that's happening, material starting to go into the ground floor and follow up through the construction. You start to see the beginnings of what might be the wood framing, the roof framing happening. Then the actual roofing goes on and systems are getting integrated. We start cladding the building with waterproofing. And yet, inclement weather doesn't shut things down because the schedule doesn't change. The academic year doesn't change because you've had a week of bad weather. So sometimes you're doing it in the snow or in heavy rain. And then the cladding goes on. This was metal roofing and brick to match a lot of the buildings at Pacific's campus. And then the finish grading happens and landscape comes in, and there's stuff happening inside the building also, finishes and drywall and cabinetry and eventually furniture. And then you've got this finished product. And so buildings look different and sequencing of construction can be different from building to building, but for a typical residence hall project, that's kind of a nice series to think about and one that you might experience when you're on a team or you're seeing a new building go up on your campus. And then last but not least, that ceremony at the end where the owners get to cut the ribbon. And there are often in our communities ceremonies. In the case of the University of Oregon, Kalapuya Ilihi, we had a smudging ceremony because of the naming and the significance around the indigenous Kalapuya culture. Very special during that groundbreaking ceremony. At Pacific University, we had dignitaries come back. Congressman Alcoin came and spoke because the building behind him was a renovation we did, and it was dedicated to him. And then over here are Oregon State. You see some familiar faces, maybe Dan Larson, Stephen Jenkins in the background, where we dedicated the new residence hall at Oregon State just last year.
The things that I'm thinking about on the housing side during construction project is making sure that the community is informed, and that particularly if there are residential buildings in the same neighborhood, that we are giving routine updates and helping them manage expectations regarding noise and other disruptions. Including, identifying and mitigating impacts, which may involve, early on trying to get the construction schedule outlined with key milestones in the academic calendar. I'm also thinking a lot about then the operational considerations in the building. That's when it starts to get, real, of how are we getting the right maintenance plans in place? Are the things that I know are fussy, like elevators, electronic locks, cameras, trash chutes, are those tended to our standards, and that we're keeping a close eye on those? And then thinking about transitioning to occupancy. And so, making sure on the assignment side that you're building those spaces into your assignment system and application process and all the different nuts and bolts that need to be in place to have humans move in a few months.
So speaking of move-in, we really pay a lot of attention to move-in because we realize that it may or may not be part of our scope of services or our professional expertise, but we know how critical it is to give you enough time to not only have furniture and students move in, but your staff to be oriented. There's a lot that goes on. And so we really build out time in the schedule and try and give you that as much of that time as possible. And years ago now already. My daughter recently is a college student. She's finishing her sophomore year. But when I got to be a parent experiencing move-in, it was quite different than being a professional architect. I thought I knew what all this meant, and I got to deepen my understanding of it and also represent my alma mater, given that U of O decided to jump to the Big Ten. But that's for another time. But I also realized just how much stuff students bring and the impact that has on your staff and move-in is so critical.
Yeah, and there are two layers to the move-in concept. There's the one-time move-in where we're getting all of the owner-provided furnitures, fixtures, equipment into the building, and then the ongoing annual process. And both need to be tended to really thoughtfully. But when I think about then typically in our our organization, we have a pretty heavy hand in picking that FFE, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, because we want things that are the balance of comfortable, durable, but also standardized. And so on our campus, all of the beds with two buildings exception are exactly the same. So they're interchangeable. And that's important to me, versus having each architect be able to spec their own bed. And then you've got to figure out how to maintain 15 different bed types. That move into occupancy. So are we transitioning all of the maintenance documentation and plans into the people that are going to be maintaining it? Some one-time things that I always think about, you never want to move in a building without having someone flush every toilet, to make sure that it works and it doesn't leak, and check every key so you don't end up with a disaster on move-in day. So we take time on the front end, to go and do that with our staff. And then the actual logistics of where are people going to park, how are they unloading, what's the routing from the curbside to the elevator up into the rooms.
All right. You've been drinking from the fire hose, a ton of information coming at you. Couldn't possibly keep it all squared away. So what do you remember from all this? What should be the takeaways? Um,
Yeah. So, the highest level, again, I've said this just a couple times already, but housing professionals must understand and be able to articulate the impact the physical environment has on the student experience. And if that is true, then all of this, that we just talked about is part of our domain and part of our professional world. Your and our participation in the design process is essential to advocating for student well-being and ensuring that that experience is central to a design solution. I encourage everybody to get involved. If it isn't necessarily natural for your role, but there's a project going on your campus, ask the leadership if there's a way to, either on a one-time basis or an ongoing basis, to participate, to get this tool into your tool belt. Because as you advance in the profession, inevitably you will have a project at some point, and the more background you bring into that, the more effective you'll be. And it's not as scary as it seems. We have partners like Kurt and others who have really centered their practice around higher education and student housing, and they, sometimes sound like student housing people, and it's really joyous to hear, them repeating some of the things that we've been saying for years, and in new contexts and new settings. And, you are a part of that process and team. So we hope today we've been able to both solidify the importance of this topic in your professional journey, and also give you enough information to be dangerous, as you move along into projects. And I think we've got, I'll give Kurt a chance to give any closing comments, and then we should have 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
No comments. That was a great close. I think if we should open it up and use our time for any questions you might have. We can go back to any slide that you want to look at if that's a desire as well.
If anyone has questions, feel free to just unmute and ask them, or you can put it in the chat if you prefer.
Oops, I closed screen. Sorry.
That's fine.
I'll throw one out there for you, Kurt. Design build as a model seems to be gaining traction. Is there a difference between progressive design build and just design build?
Yes, I think fundamentally it's in the procurement processes where the primary difference is, because either way, that design build contract will look the same with an owner, and ideally the integrated team and the process that unfolds would look the same. So progressive design build is really more of a qualifications-based selection of a design build team. It is not based on a hard bid. A design build competition is a university asking a design team and a builder to come up with an idea, a design, and have it priced and present it, saying, this is what we think you want, and here's the price tag. My personal opinion, the big problem with that is the voices of the folks that we just said were important. So I think universities often have to unwind the process to say, well, we love you, we want to hire you, we love the price tag, but we want to change all these things. And that gets very messy very quickly. University of Washington has a great design build process. It's progressive design build. They don't actually ask for the design build teams to get together first. Now they're asking for the general contractor to go through a process, and then they are part of the selection of the architect. But you still are at the same end result where you get the design build team up front, you sign that single design build contract, which has a single source of responsibility. So I think that hopefully answered it.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, Patrick.
I have a question, and I know it's going to be a hard question, but I don't think this has happened ever for us, but I have heard in student affairs, like you shared this example of always testing the toilets. I can recall an assistant director shared a story that they finished the building, and when people started moving in, none of the faucets worked, none of the water was working. When something goes wrong and it goes really wrong, how does one recover from that? Because I remember hearing that and thinking, wouldn't that require you to rip out all the walls and redo the piping, which I don't know enough about construction. And then I think the other question always comes up, the liability piece. Who's responsible if something does go wrong? Again, I won't share the school, but I've heard another example. It was a project that went $1 million over budget. Like, how do we recover when those sort of situations happen?
Yeah, there's a lot there, Patrick, and I'm sure Kurt will have some stories and insight on that. In terms of responsibility and recovery, that's a really nuanced situation, and there are a couple, principles at play there in terms of who's responsible for that. And part of it is a determination whether if there was a problem, is it something that wasn't foreseen or was it not foreseeable in the first place? That's relevant. There's a body of law that's actually construction defect law that we've actually utilized on our campus, and it has to meet a certain standard and a certain bar and not be just something that went wrong, but a pretty elevated standard to then go back and hold either a contractor or a designer accountable. There's also a warranty process. And so typically, like a car, for a year after a building opens, there's nearly a soup to nuts warranty in place. And on our campus, we've developed a very in-depth process to track warranty issues and track them through to completion, because that's our one shot to get anything that isn't right fixed at pretty much no cost, unless it's a design change, and then there's different aspects to it. Thankfully, we, with the exception of one project where we opened a building and there was a hot water fitting that wasn't seated right, and occupied for a while, and it resulted in a flood that took a whole wing off for several months. That was the only major issue that we've encountered, and in that case, the construction, the general contractor's insurance policy covered that repair, and also covered mitigation costs associated with us not being able to house students there. But Kurt, I'll throw that back to you.
Yeah, and we could talk for an hour just on that. Hey, maybe this is the next subject of our a presentation, Josh. I think I would say the best teams don't point fingers, and they first and say, let's fix the problem. So, in the case of the plumbing not working, there could be about 15 different sources of the problem. But the design team, the contractor, the engineers, the owner, we all have to say we have to fix the problem first, because you've got to turn it back on, whatever that means, to get the students in to sort of move the process forward, and then you can do a post-mortem on all of the things that Josh talked about. So our position is we're partners. This isn't just a transactional relationship. We are partners with UW. We want to maintain the partnership for years to come. And so if something goes wrong, we have to fix it first. And then if you have some responsibility, you need to accept that or own it in some way. And that could take a whole bunch of different avenues, I guess. So.
Yeah, and oftentimes when I've heard about those stories, it's usually a result of a construction schedule getting jammed up for some reason and then hurrying up to get to a move-in date. And, there are things that can be done throughout the process to mitigate that. And I would just say that, it's on all of us to help not make bad decisions. And if a building really isn't ready, it's not ready, and you should find other options than moving students into something that isn't ready, if you can. Easier said than done.
Right.
I also see go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, Brandy asked the question, and I first had a big smile when I saw her pronouns. But the question, I I'm not sure I understand the question, Brandy. You're saying about the process of acquiring a project. You mean
Yeah,
literally
I was trying to figure out how to wordsmith it, but so the beginning stages before the two of you would be able to get together. So what is that process from both of your ends? Like you all are putting, Kurt, you all are putting a bid in, or are you receiving that information from folks like Josh? Like what
Okay.
is that process?
Yeah, it initiates on the campus side, and there are a couple different ways it can happen. Sometimes it's just a one building project, and there are a variety of reasons that come up. Other times, and what we experienced on my campus is we actually had a housing master plan done because we knew demand was increasing, we were overcrowded, and our buildings were all 50 years old. So we engaged a comprehensive 10-year plan with 13 buildings as part of it over the course of time, and that serves as a foundation to executing individual projects. There is a lot of work that happens on the campus side, though, once you have an idea to make sure you've got buy-in and money and all of the different things that need to happen before it's real. And that often can take years to get to that point. But assuming all of that has been managed with the right justification and funding and all of that, then it manifests in putting out a procurement process where we, as a campus, articulate what we're looking for and ask bidders to respond to that. And that's where someone like Kirk comes into play.
So then on your end, Kurt, you all are, how do you decide if you're wanting to put in, a bid for this, or what is that? What is there guidelines that you all try to follow? Is this like if Joshua came with you to this 10-year plan or 15-year plan, you're like, I don't know if we really have the capacity to do that. So what comes to your mind as you're deciding to whether to pursue or not?
Sure, sure. Good question. So on the professional side, on the private side, um, well, it's a variety. They're probably different between situations, and so let me just throw some of them out. One is capacity. I have a firm of 80 people. I need enough projects to keep them working and food on their plates, and so we track our billings, if you will, to look out to see when we need to bring in more work. And that starts to make decisions around when to pursue work and when not to. And it's never that black and white, like, oh, it looks like in 6 months we need a new project, let's go get one. Timing is also very important. You might, and the network that, you've all invited me, family of Northwest NWACUHO. I've known Josh and talked to Josh, and sometimes he'll let me know that there's a project 6 months away, and I start saying, "Oh, that's interesting. What's about? Tell me about the project." Da, 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 da. Also relationships matter, at least to me. So if I have a choice to try and work with Josh again at University of Washington versus some college in some part of the world I know nothing about, that's an easy decision because trust is built over time. And I think it's the relationships have been very reciprocal. There's the life's too short. I like working with people I like. And so that influences things as well. But so we have to think like a business because we are one. But also we lean into the work that we bring. For me, it's student housing in all of its machinations. We do a lot of housing master planning. Brandy, as you know, we did the vision plan for you. But I love small renovations that have big impact and new complex projects that transform the campus. It's also very interesting. So I think that's answering your question.
Yes, yes. I know I have my camera off, but I was in the middle of eating. But yes, for someone like myself whose work is more connected to the diversity, equity, inclusion side of housing and dining, like I don't get a chance to really know much about this part, and it's a big part. So
Yeah.
this
I,
is super helpful.
I would offer that when RFPs or projects come out and they're sharing their values up front, not just we're a research institution of 45,000. When they say something like, this project is focused on raising the experience for first generation students or something, I go, oh, there's values behind this, the group of people that have crafted this message. And that jumps up in priority scale for us as just give me 2,000 beds and I don't care what it looks like. Well, I can do that too, but maybe
Right.
I'd rather have a project that has a bigger impact. So your voice early in the crafting of those messages can be very powerful as well.
And with that, I think we probably wrapped up on time. So certainly, you know, we'll put our email addresses in the chat. And if you have anything else that comes up with questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Josh and Kurt, so much. That was amazing. I myself have been thrown into these processes, and it's a lot, but it's really rewarding. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. The recording of the session will sometime soon be up on our YouTube channel. For Northwest CUHO members, make sure to keep an eye on your emails for future webinars. And then you can also find us on social media, Instagram and Facebook. Both are just at Northwest CUHO. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Have a great Friday and a nice weekend.
Take care, everyone.